So my name's Chris Wright. I'm an Associate Professor in Work and Organisational Studies at the University of Sydney in the Business School. And my research focuses on work and labour market policy. Yeah, so the right to disconnect laws were passed by Parliament in Canberra earlier this year, and they're coming into effect on the 26th of August. What they do is that they provide a right for employees if an employer contacts them outside of work hours, for example, if they call them or if they email them outside of their standard hours of work, that the employee is no longer obliged to reciprocate that contact. No, the provisions don't prevent employers from contacting, from calling or emailing, for example, their employees outside of working hours. All they do is ensure that employees don't have to respond. And this provides an important protection in the context of the impacts that technology have had upon people's work in recent years. So particularly since the rise of the smartphone, the boundary that's traditionally existed between people's time at work and their time outside of work have eroded significantly. And that creep, what's been called availability creep, into people's time outside of work, aided by technology, has had some significant negative effects upon employees' well-being, upon their job satisfaction, and also even on their relationships. This law and this right to disconnect provides a really important protection that will go some of the way towards helping to restore people's boundaries between their work and their non-work lives. Australia's somewhat behind the curve internationally on this, but we have nevertheless seen various organisations in Australia already put in place right to disconnect provisions for their workplaces, either through company policy or through enterprise bargaining arrangements, through agreements with unions. Many of these organisations that have done so proactively have done this because they recognise the benefits of these provisions, that restoring the boundary between people's work and non-work lives, the evidence suggests, makes them more committed when they are at work. It makes them more happy, it makes them more productive, and those things are all ultimately good for the employer too. There's no evidence that I'm aware of that indicates the new right to disconnect laws are going to harm productivity. We really need to understand what drives productivity. Among the various things that impact upon an employee's work effort include things like whether they're satisfied. A happy worker is much more likely to be a productive worker. Also, arrangements that allow employees' satisfaction at work to be maintained mean that they're much less likely to leave their jobs. In other words, they're likely to reduce employee turnover. So I'm very confident that the new right to disconnect laws can coexist very peacefully alongside flexible working arrangements. And that's because the new provisions apply to people's standard working hours. So they still allow an employer to contact and expect reciprocation of that contact during work hours, no matter when they may be. All they do is that they provide a protection to an employee that they are not obliged to reciprocate outside of the standard workday. So they can very easily coexist with flexible working arrangements. Well, unfortunately, some organisations and some industries have very unhealthy working arrangements in place, and those arrangements where people are expected to work 24 hours a day or be available around the clock, they present very significant barriers to inclusion for workers who don't have the luxury or the ability of being able to return an email or pick up the phone at 11:30 p.m. at night, for example. I think that the right to disconnect laws will have a positive impact upon leading to more healthy workplace cultures and industry cultures, where there are currently very unhealthy arrangements in place. But it should also be emphasised that if there are industries where that rely upon people being available to work outside of standard working hours, that those arrangements can continue to remain so long as various criteria are satisfied. One of the key criteria being that if an employee is being compensated in some way or another for being available outside of standard working hours, then that will almost certainly be allowed to continue under the new laws. So essentially, if an employee is not having their right to disconnect protected, they are, under the new laws, asked to first raise this with their manager, and they can perhaps get a representative like a union to do that on their behalf. If that doesn't lead to a positive outcome from an employee, they can then take their case to the Fair Work Commission. The Fair Work Commission can impose what's called a stop order, which basically, as the name suggests, requires the employer to stop expecting their employee to return the phone call or to reply to the email outside of working hours. And if the employer still doesn't uphold their obligations and continues to insist that the employee be available outside of working hours, then there are various sanctions that are available to the Fair Work Commission that they can impose upon the employer. So there's a range of escalating provisions and protections that are in place that allow an employer's right to disconnect to be upheld under the new arrangements.